Shalom, Bruchim Habayim, and welcome to Shevi'im Pani LaTorah, to the 70 Faces of the Torah, and also Sulam Yaakov. We are back to continue with our second part teaching on Parashat Vayeishev, which is based off the Haftarah reading found in Sefer Amos. And here what we're going to be doing, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be focusing on the subject of understanding the Harugei Mlchut, which refers to the 10 righteous leaders that were put to death by the Roman Empire. Now, if you have not got the chance to check out my part 1 teaching on Parashat Vayeishev, please go and take a look at that teaching first and then come on over to this teaching. That way you have a full understanding of the topics that I'm dealing with here. Okay? Now, for those that watch part 1, you'll know that there I focused my teaching specifically on the Haftarah, or Sefer Amos, in conjunction with the Mechirat Yosef, with the sale of Joseph. And in that teaching I mentioned that on Yom Kippur we recite a piyut, or a poem, which deals with the death of the 10 righteous leaders of the Second Temple period that were put to death by the Roman Empire because their death served as an atonement for the sins of Joseph's brothers that when they sold him into exile. And this is known as the Harugei Mlchut. And it's a very interesting concept that I wanted to address on its own terms. Now, I also like to say at this point in time, for those who have been following me on social media, specifically over there on Facebook, I made some posts recently that prompted some questions. And I want to thank everyone for their interaction, okay? Some challenging viewpoints that I brought up. And a lot of the information contained in the second part teaching is going to answer some of those questions I brought up. I'm not going to go on a tangent to address them independently, but I will reference them periodically in this teaching here. Now, the term Harugei Mlchut is interesting because in a sense you would translate that as capital punishment, is really what it means. And it originally referred to somebody who was put to death at the request of a Jewish king. So if the Jewish king at any time of Israel's history found a problem with a subject that defied his orders, he would then send a request to the Sanhedrin, who were responsible for oversight of capital punishment, in which the Sanhedrin, they would then accept the request and proceed with the actual performance that we call Harugei Mlchut. And for those who want to look this up, there's various places found amongst Chazal. Specifically, you can find it in Bava Basra 10b, Bava Metzia 107b, Masechet Sota 48b, and also as you see on your screen, we have a reference brought down in Masechet Sanhedrin 11a, where it speaks about the death of Yehuda ben Bava, as says here. I'm not going to read it in detail, but you can read it. I'm just going to paraphrase that. They wanted to give a heshbit, a respectable eulogy for Yehuda ben Bava. However, they were not able to do so. And the reason why is because of Harugei Mlchut, because he was put to death via capital punishment. And what that indicates is that even though he was considered a chassid of some sorts, someone respectable, he was not able to have these respective titles based upon him due to the fact that he was put to death under capital punishment. Now, mind you, this is capital punishment at the authority of the Jewish court, not a non-Jewish court. So that's really where this term applies, Harugei Mlchut. Now, the first time that Harugei Mlchut is used with emphasis on aseret, with 10, okay, or asara as they say in some translations, is once again in relation to the 10 rabbinical leaders who were killed by the Romans. Now, this is a very, very interesting subject, okay, and I want everyone to understand this, because ultimately this all goes back to the betrayal of Yosef himself, the sale of Yosef. In fact, the very first source that connects the death of the 10 righteous rabbis by the Roman Empire and connects it back to the atoning for the sins of Joseph's brothers is brought down in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who brought down in the Midrash Sefer Mishli, specifically Proverbs 1:13, where he said that the death of the 10 martyrs, עשרה הרוגי מלכות, happened only because of one thing, and one thing alone, and it happened because of Mechiratov Shel Yosef, because of the sale of Joseph. This is why this happened. And based upon other Mefarshim rabbinical commentaries, they will mention that the cause of every Jewish suffering and illness that has plagued the Jews throughout time is due to the sale of Joseph. Now, what's important about this, and you need to listen very clearly, especially for those who were following me online, that I had some questions and you weren't getting, that I didn't find the answer to. Until this point in time, okay, regarding the 10 rabbis who were killed by the Roman Empire, death via al-Kiddush Hashem, which means a martyr's death, one who dies to sanctify the name of Hashem. And this is not the same meaning of jihad, like when extremist Muslims take their life for the honor of Allah. There's a difference in Judaism in how extremist Muslims view themselves, okay? In that regard, there's a difference there. Up to this point, anyone who died a martyr's death for the honor of Hashem and His Torah was not looked upon favorably according to Jewish law. I'm going to say this again. Any Jew, considering that they're a Sadiq, righteous, who died what we call in Hebrew Mesirut HaNefesh, a self-sacrifice. They negated themselves. They were willing to die for the honor of Hashem. Now, once again, not in an extremist way, but they were willing to die for a just cause, willing to die so they wouldn't violate any of the mitzvot of the Torah. The halacha at that time, prior to what happened with Rome putting these 10 rabbis to death, the halacha stipulated that if you nullified your life based upon Kiddush Hashem, it was not viewed favorably. In fact, the halacha ruled that any Sadiq who committed Mesirut HaNefesh for the honor of Hashem, their name was removed from all halachic rulings and from anything that had to do with the transmission of the Torah. Take a look at what it says here in Bava Kama 61a. It's brought down that this goes back to the Beit Din of Shmuel Hanavi. This is Samuel the prophet who anointed David HaMelech. So this is a halachic origin on this. Very important. It says, I have learned from the Beit Din of Shmuel Hanavi Rama. Anyone who does a Mesurah HaNefesh, who's willing to give up their life for what? For Al Divrei Torah, for matters of Torah. It says over here, Ein Omerin Davar Halacha, that we do not record halacha in their name. This is very important. This is a halakhic ruling. According to these views here, in fact, according to the views that's brought down over in Masechah Sanhedrin, the ruling that's mentioned here in Bava Kama about not having your name honored due to dying al Kiddush Hashem is based upon the verse that's found in Parashat Kiddushim that mentions, when it comes to observance of mitzvot, that the purpose of the mitzvot is for v'chai bahem, is in order for us to live by them, not to die for them. And just to quote the verse in its totality, we see over here Leviticus chapter 18, verse 5, the Torah says, Ushmartem et chukotai ve'et mishpotai asher ya'aseh otam. Ha'adam v'chai bahem ani Adonai. You shall observe my chukim, my decrees, and also mishpati, my laws, which man shall carry out, and by which he shall what? He shall live. He shall have life from them. So says Hashem. Now, we take a look here. Based upon this, Chazal and Masechah Sanhedrin ruled against the idea of one dying al Kiddush Hashem. It says here, and should one not transgress the prohibition of avodah zarah, idol worship, to save his life? But isn't it taught in the Baraita, which is an additional piece of Mishnaic literature? Rav Ishmael said, from where is it derived that if a person is told, worship idols and you will not be killed? From where is it derived that he should worship the idol and not be killed? The pasuk or the verse states there in Leviticus 18:5, you shall keep my chukim, my judgments, my laws, which a person shall do, and he shall what? he shall live. V'chai bahem, he shall live in them. And what's it say here? They were not given, the Torah, the mitzvot were not given so that one will die due to their observance. This is a very fascinating passage here. The logic behind this halakha, friends, was that if a person who was a tzaddik, who chose to die, okay, they choose to give up their life in order not to violate the Torah, not in order so there be a desecration of God's name. That individual who chooses to do that, according to the halakha, is that he would forfeit the right of having his name associated with the Torah. In other words, his name wouldn't be associated with the teachings. Now, it's not the same as the acronym that's called Yeshu, Yamach Shemo, okay, which means may his name be blotted out and forgotten, his memory, right? Livrocho, just be gone. That does not have the same connotation over here in this halacha, okay? What we see over here is that the rabbis viewed the Torah as life, and therefore, if one was put in a compromised situation where their life could be voided because of a pagan religion or threat of a dictator, that it was permissible for them to fake it until they made it. In other words, they accepted, oh yeah, I recognize this God, or I recognize your authority, but they really didn't. They just did that so they could get themselves out of that situation of death. This is also where, by the way, many Bnei Anusim justified their conversion to Christianity, because under threat of death, okay, they felt uncomfortable, so they said, yeah, no problem, we'll say the sinner's prayer, we'll acknowledge the Trinity of Christianity or whatever came with that package, and really they continue being Jews. Also, we see this was the example that many Jews did when it came to Islam, when there was the Muslim caravans conquesting through the Middle East. Many Jews also, under pretense of death, they accepted Islam while still being Jewish. Now, mind you, by the time this happened, there was also a big machloket amongst the spiritual leaders of the Jewish community who did not accept that view of Bnei Anusim doing what they did. And therefore, many Jews, instead of becoming Anusim, forced is what that means from the word anus, which means to force oneself, is that they fled in their innocence. And, because they say the halacha has changed. We don't do that no more. That's important, okay? Very critical to understand. At the time of the Aseret Harugei Mlchut is when the halachic principle changed. Everything changed. Once the Roman Empire began to outlaw Judaism, outlaw the Torah, that's when we begin to see certain rabbinic figures willing to die al Kiddush Hashem. In fact, according to Jewish history, we learn about Rabbi Hananiah ben Tradion. Rabbi Hananiah was a third-generation Tana who lived in the second part of the first century and the beginning of the second century of the Common Era. And among the rabbis whose deaths are recorded in the Talmud, he is the only rabbi who consistently defied the decrees of the Roman Empire regarding observance of the Torah. And what we see is that amongst his arrests, which he was put to death, if you look at his other rabbinical colleagues at that time, you'll see that some died, like for instance, Rabbi Kiva during the Bar Chofa rebellion. He was captured and then crucified, and his skin was being ripped apart with the cat o' nine tails. But Rabbi Hananiah had a colleague, Rabbi Elazar, who was in jail with him, but Rabbi Elazar was acquitted on his charges, and therefore he did not suffer the same demise as his counterpart, Rabbi Hananiah, did. And what we see, the Talmud records, is that when Rome began to outlaw the Torah, just like the Greeks did, but at a greater capacity now, okay, is that Rabbi Hananiah publicly defied the Romans, that he held open Torah studies, he gathered massive groups of Jews to teach them Torah, doing everything, knowing that he could be caught, captured, and executed. And what we see is that Rabbi Hananiah was willing to defy the Roman Empire because he saw that this drastic stance of defying the government was required. Because what he saw then came to be realized later by other Jews. And this is very important that I want to share with you guys. The truth had to do with the new threat to Judaism. Okay? And what was that? I mean, many people, listen, man, Rome is clamping down. Just, observe the mitzvot in your home. Why be public? Why do this? Rabbi Hananiah saw something coming. that he was not willing to yield or compromise, because he recognized if we compromise now, it's going to be difficult later. What was it that Rav Hananiah saw? He saw the change of idolatry coming. What is that change? He saw that the Roman Empire was not just going to be focusing on the worship of the sun, moon, and stars and statues, but they're going to be focusing on the worship of a human being, the Roman emperor, the God-man himself. Sound familiar? According to Masechet Avodah Zarah, there's an interesting conversation that takes place between Rabbi Akiva and a gentleman called Zonim, which addresses a new understanding about Avodah Zarah, idolatry, that's beginning to take place in the Roman Empire. We read over here in Avodah Zarah 55a, Zonim said to Rabbi Akiva, we both know in our hearts that idolatry has no substance, literally nothing, right? There's nothing to it. In fact, I would like to point out for those coming from Christian backgrounds, cross-reference this saying with Paul in 1 Corinthians 8:4, where he tells the Corinthians, the non-Jews who are coming to the faith in Hashem, Ki ein elil ba'olam. We know there is no idols in the world. There's only one God, ein ol milvado. There is no other reality but Hashem. It's the same form of reasoning that's being applied over here between Rabbi Akiva and Zonim. The only difference now is that this conversation begins to segue into a new threat of Avodah Zarah that the Jews are going to be facing. And this is critical for those from Christianity to understand this. What this means, friends, is that at this time of the Roman Empire, Avodah Zarah was no longer going to be based on planetary worship and statues. Rather, it's going to be based upon the veneration of the Roman Empire, or the Roman emperor, who is viewed as a half God and half man. Once again, sound familiar to some people's theology? That Jesus, Yeshua, Yeshu, was considered half man and half God, according to the theology of the Roman church fathers? Roman citizens at that time began to see the emperor as embodying and representing the empire both politically and spiritually. The emperor not only contained the good physical traits, military strength, but also was considered to contain divine traits. You need to keep this in mind with Christianity, which later borrowed these same ideas and applied it to the historical Yeshua in the New Testament. And for those who've been following my trend on social media, this is, if you notice, I've been arguing with some of you guys that the Yeshu in the Talmud, the various Yeshus that are mentioned there, it's not the same historical Yeshua in the New Testament. They're different ages, different characters. But the Yeshua of the New Testament, his image was hijacked and then weaponized against the Jews because of what was happening here with veneration of Roman leaders. From a Jewish perspective, this was a major problem. Why was it a major problem? Because at this time, Rome boasted how it defeated the God of the Jews when it destroyed the temple in the year 70. Okay, anyone that's ever been to Rome, you'll see the Arch of Titus, which has that depiction of the Romans celebrating, coming back from Jerusalem, where they stole all the riches, and it's now stashed away in the Vatican basement, by the way, and they used stolen money to build that Roman Colosseum where they would host gladiator sports. And by the way, contrary to Christianity, those weren't Christians killed in the Colosseum at that time. There were Jews being put to death in the Colosseum, okay? Whether they were Jewish believers in Yeshua, disciples of his, the immediate disciples, and also Jews who did not believe in the Yeshua of the New Testament. They were Jews being put to death, okay? And therefore, they used stolen Jewish money, destroyed Jerusalem, mocked the God of Israel, and then slaughtered Jews inside the Colosseum with gladiators and also exotic animals that the Romans captured and brought to the Colosseum. The destruction of the temple meant that the God of the Jews was weak and he failed. This is another reason why the land of Israel's name was changed in Latin to Palestinia, which is Palestine, because Rome thought that the Jews and their God was a joke. Their Torah was a joke. And it was in this environment that we learn that the Roman Emperor Hadrian increased his war against the Torah. Under his administration, it's recorded the amount of mitzvot that he prohibited and banned from being observed. He banned the reciting of the Shema. He banned observance of Shabbat, by the way. He banned the wearing of tefillin and tzitzit. He also outlawed the establishment of a Sanhedrin. This is why, if you're familiar with the city of Yavne in the year 90, which takes place 20 years after the destruction of Chorban HaBeit HaMikdash, that the reconvening of the Sanhedrin under the authority of Rabbi Yehoshua and the Chachamim, which reflect the views of Hillel, they convened in a way that would not be noticeable to the Roman authorities, because the Roman authorities were familiar with the older layout of the Sanhedrin. So they had to do it in secret. Also, besides the Sanhedrin, any smaller courts were not allowed to be established. Rome also outlawed Jews gathering, guess what? In their synagogues. Just like some liberal leaders today do not allow people to go gather in their synagogues due to some fake agenda. Also with people in their churches. Listen closely here. The Roman Empire also banned the public reading of the Torah and the public reading of the Megillah Esther. Now, why would they do that? Because it might influence the Jews when hearing these stories, how the Jews were able to overthrow Persia, Haman, and have victory, or how the Jews overthrew Paro, or defeated the Gentile kings in the wilderness. The Romans didn't want the Jews to get any inspiration from their Torah to become a threat to them. Also, Rome prohibited the affixing of mezuzot to any gateways and doorways. They also banned the distribution of donations to Kohanim and Leviim. You got to remember, Levites and the Kohanim, they didn't work. They depended upon the tithes of the people. So now with no temple or anything going on, they were not even allowed to receive donations. So they were left to go schlepping in the streets for themselves. Also, there was a prohibition of eating matzah. So I know some people might say, wow, a Pesach without matzah might be a miracle. But listen, when you're deprived of your mitzvot, it's really not a laughing matter. Also, they were prohibited from building sukkahs. They could not even purchase arba minim, no waving a lulav, none of that. And also for Hanukkah, you had a great miracle of Hanukkah when the Jews defeated the Greeks. They were not permitted to light their Chanukiot. Also, immersion into a mikveh was also prohibited. And blowing shofarot was also prohibited. There's many, many other mitzvot that Rome came down and said, no, 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 no. And if we find you doing it, we're going to kill you on the spot. You think the Nazis did what they did? No. This came down from the Romans. It came down from the Greeks. They did it. They executed Jews on the spot. The Roman emperor, why did he do this? He did it for psychological and tactical reasons. Romans weren't stupid, by the way. Just like the New World Order puppets are not stupid today. By using these tactics, the Roman emperor hoped to spiritually weaken the Jewish people from their strength in Hashem. He figured, if I can lock them down, if I can deprive them of their source of spiritual strength, I can defeat them. I can defeat them and I can defeat their God. Sounds eerily familiar of a lot of things happening today, like stay in your homes. Don't you dare gather in your synagogue. Don't you dare try to have a minyan. Don't you dare try to come together and study the Torah. Because if you do, we're going to fine you $10,000. If you do, we're going to throw you in jail. You better comply. Friends, you better wake up and smell the coffee or the shashuka real quick. Because what's happening today is a repeat of what has happened in the past. This is why it's important to understand the end of my part 1 study about defying the New World Order. Now here's where things get interesting. By depriving the Jewish people of their right to observe the Torah, it would appear that the Jewish people were obeying the decree of Rome, which would be seen as a concession to the emperor, to the ruler, which meant that the Jews were now bowing to a God of flesh and blood. You understand that? If the Jews say, okay, no problem, we'll give up our Shabbos, we'll give up our kashrut, we'll give up our bris milah, we'll give these things up. We won't daven no more, we'll give them up. It's not just that they gave it up for safety, but it was seen as a reverence to an individual that perceived himself as a god. That is the highest form of idolatry. It goes beyond recognizing planets and sticks and stones as deities. And now you understand why Jews have had a hard time accepting the church's message of Jesus Christ by using the same tactics that the Romans use by deifying their emperors. They weaponized the New Testament against the Jews. Such a concession, friends, was the greatest threat to Judaism. And it was very clear to the sages at that point in time, at the time of the Aseret Harogei Malchut, that the kingdom of the Romans is diametrically opposed to Malchut Shemayim, to the kingdom of heaven. And the two cannot exist. And therefore it was halachically forbidden for any Jew to show loyalty to Rome. That is also why, on a side note, when it comes to the New Testament, why a lot of people email me and ask me my views of the New Testament. I tell people, I don't have a single problem with the New Testament. I have a problem with the interpretations of the New Testament. From my research and years of study of the New Testament, I see that it was weaponized against the Jewish people. I'll give you a perfect example. Any God-fearing righteous Jew knew that if you sold anyone out to the Romans, it was akin to suicide. In the New Testament, when Yeshua was put to death, who put him to death? Now, the Goyim say, the Jews, Christ killers. Nonsense. Okay? The people who put him to death was the corrupt court of the Sanhedrin via the Sadducees, not the Poroshim. While Yeshua had conflicts of interest with some of the Poroshim, what you have to understand is that the Poroshim did not put him to death. The Poroshim made up the 23-seat Sanhedrin, which according to Halakha was required to pass capital punishment. Harogei Malchut. You understand? And that if under capital punishment by the lower court Sanhedrin, they would bury the criminals in a criminal cemetery. When Yeshua was put to death, where was he buried? In a tomb that was owned by Joseph of Arimathea, and Joseph of Arimathea was a Perush, a Pharisee, also with Nicodemus, who was also recorded in the Talmud as a rich ruler in Jerusalem in those days. Is that coincidence? No, it's not. So because the lower Sanhedrin did not agree with the Sadducee Sanhedrin about Yeshua, they were not responsible for putting him to death. That's something that the kangaroo court, the control court, of the Democrat Sadducees ran and owned, and they put Yeshua to death. And that's why any Jew that would sell their own brother out to a foreign government like Rome was akin to committing suicide. They would never do it. But once again, the interpretations of Christianity paint another picture. They weaponize the text and they blame every single Jew and their mother for being a quote-unquote Christ killer. And you can't blame Jews for wanting to stay far away from the New Testament and Christianity as far as possible. And in fact, I will say here that Jews do not need the New Testament whatsoever. Okay? Now, it was during this era that dying Al-Kiddush Hashem took on a new significant role in the life of Jews compared to the earlier halachic rulings that I quoted there in Bava Kama. Dying Al-Kiddush Hashem was no longer condemned. It was now condoned. And in fact, it contained redemptive qualities. Because from this very concept is where we start finding in the Talmud where the sages would begin teaching how the death of the righteous brings atonement to the Jewish people like Yom Kippur. That the death of the 10 rabbis, the Aseret Harugei, Malchut, they brought a kapara atonement for the sins of Joseph's 10 brothers who betrayed him. That the death of a Sadiq or Sadiqim can atone for a whole generation. That sounds Christian. No, it's not, friends. It's Yiddishkeit, it's Judaism. Take a look here. In the earliest sources of Yerushalmi and Masechet Yoma Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph, and the name of R Yehezqel bar Ba, he says, we know that Bnei Aharon be'achad Nisan. We know that they died on the 1st of Nisan because that's when the tabernacle was inaugurated in Parashat Shmini. Lama, why is it then that we remember their deaths on Yom Kippur? Parashat Achrei Mot, why is that? This is to teach you that just as Yom Kippur atones for the Jewish people, so too the death of the righteous atones for the Jewish people. This is not Christianity. The interpretations of Christianity in the New Testament is questionable about understanding the death of Yeshua. This is important. When Yeshua died, and what I would consider a misirut nefesh, it was when the halacha was binding that if anyone righteous nullifies their life for divrei Torah, for any principles of the Torah, we don't associate them anymore halachically, nor do we remember them for the teachings of the Torah, because one should live by the mitzvot, not die by the mitzvot. It's only when Rome comes along and starts venerating their emperor and saying he's God, do the Jews say, whoa, rega, stop, he's not God. We're not going to have this. And therefore, when they start outlawing Torah and Judaism, Jews were willing to step up to say, not happening on our watch, and they were willing to be put to death, mesirut nefesh. When Yeshua walked the earth, Rome at that time did not outlaw Judaism. They tolerated the Jews. They did not outlaw the Torah yet. And that's also very important for people, for Christian backgrounds, to understand the book of Revelation, which has been interpreted many different ways by Christianity. But please understand that that book refers to the historical narrative of what was happening with Rome. The name of Nero, the gematria 666, refers to Nero. Who's Nero? He was a psychopathic, narcissistic idiot who hated Jews. Hadrian hated Jews. They outlawed the Torah. Christianity doesn't have a Torah. In fact, Christianity said there is no Torah. It was the church fathers done away, and they weaponized Jesus in the New Testament against Jews. So what you have to understand here is that the halacha at the time of Yeshua was, if one dies misirut nefesh, we don't associate them no more with halacha. We don't mention them in conjunction with this mitzvah. We don't say anything in their name. We just don't say nothing. They're not there. They're not there at all. So it's afterwards, after the temple's destroyed, after those events, where the halakha change. So what we learn from this, friends, is that the idea of martyrdom, al kiddush Hashem, from the Second Temple through the Tananim or to the Yam Raim, and both the Yerushalmi and Bavli, teaches how the death of the righteous brings a tikkun, a restoration of Hashem's name. That's another theme in the New Testament. As the era of the rabbinical writings were coming to a close, the ending of the Gemara and the Bavli, etc., the emphasis by the rabbis of the righteous who die al kiddush Hashem, in this world, their honor has been deferred to the next world. Guess what? That's another concept you find in the New Testament in Hebrews, when it acknowledges Yeshua as a Kohen Gadol, according to the order of Melchizedek, that he will have his honor in Olam Haba, not this world. Which is another reason for Christians to understand the proper interpretation of the New Testament, that as long as the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu stands in this world, we go by the Torah of Moshe. We don't go by the Torah of Jesus, because there is no such thing. Yeshua, when he lived, abided by the halachic boundaries of Torah, mitzvot, and Judaism. Sure, he had indifferences with some of his fellow Jews, especially regarding hypocrisy, but the Talmud is replete with arguments upon Jews fighting with other Jews about integrity and transparency when it comes to Torah mitzvot. So what we learn here in conclusion, friends, is that in relation to part one that I ended, why defying the world is very important. We see that by the time in the Hashmonaim, when Greece under Antiochus basically was outlawing mitzvot, it wasn't at a point where members of the Jewish community were saying, you know what, I'm going to die al kiddush Hashem. They didn't do it. Instead, what we see that the Hashmonaim says, enough of this. We're going to get up and we're going to fight. If we die in war, we're going to do what's right for the Torah. Now, they didn't do it in the sense of dying a martyr's death. They did it in a form of war. They wanted vengeance. We're not going to take this no more. We're going to war. And we will stop. We will kill non-Jew and Jew alike that has assimilated amongst the non-Jews and getting in our way. Fast forward now, after the Jews relinquished power if you know the history, sadly there was a big blunder amongst the sons of Aaron, that instead of relinquishing power back to Shevet Yehuda, the tribe of Judah, we read about the Sadducees, before they split off from the Kohanim, okay? We learn about the king Yanai, who was supposed to be a Kohen, but he's now a king. Like he's from Shevet Yehuda. They failed to relinquish power. And because of that, there was a big conflict amongst the Jewish people. And when that conflict happened, the sages tell us that the sons of Zadok, the disciples of Zadok, started their own movement that became the Sadducean movement, where they no longer believed in the validity of the oral Torah. They questioned resurrection of the dead. They didn't believe in the coming of Mashiach. They didn't believe in the immortality of the soul, Techiat HaMetim. They didn't believe in these things, so they just held to the 5 books of Moses hyper-literally, as you see in the New Testament. And what happened was that they let Rome come in to their country to govern them and rule them and tax them. And then from that, the history tells us Yochanan Hyrcanus turned his sword at that time on the Edomites, the Bnei Esav, force converted them to Judaism, which is not halakhically valid, and then you have the whole Herod family, which then gets in bed with their Roman counterparts, and the rest is history. And you see that eventually crescendo to where Rome looked at the Jews as nothing more than a hindrance. Their God, their Torah, their spirituality is archaic, it's outdated, it's prehistoric. Let's start nullifying their belief in their God. Let's change the name of their land. And of course, the history tells us about the internal conflicts. You had zealots, you had the Sikorim, the assassinating Jews. But what happened was there was so much sinach chinam with Jew versus Jew on crime. This Jew hates that Jew. The Talmud says in Masachet Yoma, the temple was destroyed because of hate without cause. That's rooted all the way back in the sinach chinam of Yosef's brothers betraying him. You can't defeat your enemy if you're fighting amongst each other. And so what we see here, before we know it, it was too late. Rome came in and they started killing everyone. And therefore, leaders stepped up for Mesirut HaNefesh. From that point, the halakha changed. That one needs to nullify their life before Hashem to bring sanctity in order that the Torah is not compromised, so that the revelation of Hashem can be honored within this world. So what we see here, Chavarim, in closing, is a very important concept that comes to challenge us all. Is that unless we are willing to nullify ourselves for the honor of Hashem, what makes us think our name is worthy to be mentioned in relation to the Torah? Okay? Now, I'm not saying, hey, listen, go out there, jump off a bridge for God. No. Mesirut HaNefesh is not just in the physical negation of your life. It starts within the inner confines of your soul when your Yetzer Hara tells you to sin here, sin there. That's where you have to say, no, I'm going to do a Mesirut HaNefesh inside. Instead of yielding to this temptation, instead of actually gravitating towards this gossip, I'm going to adamantly refuse, like Yosef did when he defied Potiphar's wife. And he said, Vai ma'ain. No, not going to do it. Yosef realized he had to die to himself inside. He had to do a bitul hayesh within, not just without. So I would say, friends, that Kiddush Hashem is not just a physical negation of one's life, but it's also the inside, dying to one's Yetzer Hara. That's what we learn here in this week's Parasha and this week's Haftarah when it comes to nullifying ourselves, defying not just the system out there, but also the system in here sometimes that wants to run contrary to the will of Hashem. And if we're willing to actually defy our Yetzer Hara, then we can defy the outside world. And so the Torah has come to challenge us in this week's Parasha and the Haftarah to ask us, are we willing to defy? Are we willing to also undergo a form of self-sacrifice for the honor of Hashem? That's a question that each and every one of us has to answer. Hopefully, Chavarim, this teaching has been a blessing to you and the others that we do here at Sulam Yaakov. If they are, prayerfully consider supporting us financially. We have links in the bottom at the description. Click where it says see more. You can give via our PayPal link, or you can give through our building fund. We are doing a building fund right now that we have recently acquired. We're looking to raise $65,000. in order to invest into the renovations and some of the changes, the furnishings of the building, etc. And also some things we have to do for equipment to help us here with our outreach organization. And most importantly, we also ask you for your prayers, your spiritual support for us as well. And if you ever have any questions, feel free to email me, rabbi@70facesoftorah.com. I will get to those in the order that they come in. Other for now, Chavarim, I hope that this teaching has been a blessing to you. And as you get ready to light your Chanukiahs this week, your Hanukiot, once again, challenge the darkness, not just out there, but also inside. As you light your Chanukiahs, remember the fight against darkness and assimilation. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, may the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov bless you and your families. Shalom and Kol Tuv.